Okay, here we go, ready for the next session. So, up next is a gentleman called Qasar Younis from Y Combinator. Put your hands together for Qasar Younis.
Hello, everybody. They took our table away. Damn, I have nowhere to put my water. Hi, guys. Thanks for coming in now. I wanted to introduce Qasar from Y Combinator. Has a pretty impressive story, impressive life and all that. And where I'm going to ask him a few questions, but I'm going to let him first introduce himself and I'll tell you guys a little bit about his background.
So my name is Qasar, like they said. I'm a partner at Y Combinator. We're an early stage venture fund for some of you guys who might not know. And as a partner, I pick and fund companies. Before YC, I had a couple of startups. The second one was acquired by Google, and I was at Google for a few years. And then before then, I went to business school, and then before then, I was an engineer for a bunch of years, 7 years. So engineer, MBA. YC is probably my Twitter version of bio.
Your bio, yeah. And where did you come? So we talked earlier, like, where did you come from? Where were you born and stuff? I think that's really interesting to the people here.
So I am, by birth, I'm Pakistani. I was born in a small farming village in Pakistan. We came to the U.S. in the late 80s. I was in elementary school. And if there's any testament that you don't need to know anybody to be successful in Silicon Valley, it's probably me. I know absolutely nobody before I went to the Valley. Actually, my first startup had closed down. We worked on it for 2 or 3 years, and I sold all my things in Chicago, literally everything out of my apartment. And I drove out to Silicon Valley, and I went on Craigslist and found a garage for $400 a month, which is pretty cheap in Silicon Valley, and I need less than 5 people. And so definitely, if you have any ambition to move to Silicon Valley without knowing anybody, it can definitely be done. A lot of people do it, and do it. It's great.
What's your role now in YC? Like, what are you doing now?
Say again?
Your role in YC,
So I'm a partner, pick and fund companies. What that really means, I think, if you're a founder, if you're going through YC, it's 2 things. We do Tuesday night dinners. We have 10 dinners for each batch. The speakers are pretty good, I would say, kind of maybe, I don't like using the term best, but I think our next batch we have like Peter Thiel and with Elon Musk, and we have Mark Zuckerberg and Mark Andreessen. So, the best, I think, best minds in Silicon Valley.
The best of the best.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, and so we do those dinners every Tuesday, where all the founders from the current class come in and eat, talk to each other, and hear from the speakers. They're really off-the-record conversations. I think when folks like Peter or Mark or whoever are in a room of founders that's off the record, it's a very different conversation than like the traditional press junket that you go and then my other part of the job is doing office hours. So vast majority, unlike most venture funds that are out there sourcing deals and trying to get startups to apply to them, we spend 98% of our time advising companies. So I do half-hour slots, and I do them almost every day, and we just are very close to companies and figuring out everything from like technical questions to more like marketing. I mean, really everything, hiring, firing, you name it. Most of the partners at YC, almost all of them are alumni, went through YC, had companies, and companies were successful at some degree.
So you started in a small village, created a startup, sold it, and now invest in startups.
Yeah, so, I think it's I'd say it's very common in Silicon Valley, but it is pretty common.
So what do you think people mostly misunderstand with like creating companies, being an entrepreneur, startups, and stuff like that?
I think, when I talk to folks here, I think the biggest, or like, in Europe in particular, is this feeling or this emotion that people who are on the stage are somehow know what they're doing, and the people who are not don't. And I think it's a very false assumption. The distance between our understanding, as in mine and you as a founder, is very small. And so and the reason it's important to have that understanding is Like, somebody like Mark Zuckerberg who goes and starts Facebook and it becomes this $200 billion company. There's all these stories and these kind of fantasies and myths that are created around founders, but they're very disingenuous because it implies some genius. There is no genius. It is just doing it. And very few people actually do it. A lot of people talk about it. A lot of people read about it. A lot of people post on Twitter about it, but very few people say, you know what, I'm going to actually try to do this full time. And I think if you do and you really commit your life to it, I don't think it's hard. I mean, I think it's such a conventional thing that startups are very, very difficult. They are difficult for certain reasons, but if it's something that you love, it's not hard. It's something.
What are those reasons?
Why they're difficult?
Yeah.
Well, they're very rarely do they succeed. The analogy that you can think of in starting a company is kind of like you have to run off a cliff at full speed, and you're trying to get to this platform, or you're trying to even more aptly put together a parachute to get to this platform, and most people don't. Like, most people fail. That is absolutely true. There's no myth about that. But I think the best founders and the people who love kind of their life and love kind of the experience of building are very much into the process of building a company. I think, Alan's a YC alum. A bunch of the folks that spoke here are YC alums. Alan and I actually went to YC together. You can see he loves the startup world. It's not about the exit. It's not about the money that you're doing this. So if you really enjoy it and you don't like working for people, I always hated working for people. I don't want to work for anybody ever again. Like, a startup is a great way to just not do that and kind of follow your own destiny in a way.
So to your point, the people in the crowd and the people up here know pretty much the same.
Yeah.
So there's no difference. Like, there's no reason why anyone from the crowd can't do what you've done.
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. And I think, so if you're in the crowd and you don't believe that, let me tell you, the steps required to be on the stage. So, the first thing,
you call me and I put you on there.
Yeah, well, you can do that. That's a short way. Is you just call and pitch. But if you want to build a company and have some success, the step-by-step process is, at least the one I use. I personally use this. I don't know what will work for you. I wrote these things down and I did them and it worked. It's not very complicated. Number one, you have to have the right skills. So if you don't program and you want to build a software company, you got to learn to program. There's no way around it. If you don't want to do it, give up the fantasy of doing a software startup. It's just that simple. Just have an honest conversation with yourself in the mirror and say, I don't like programming. I don't want to do this. I'm not going to do a software company. But if you can do that, or whatever the skills, a hardware company, whatever it is, that's number one. Get those skills. Number two, be around people who actually are interested in the space. And people here are interested, but there's online communities, Hacker News, etc. There's certain subreddits that are, and so be around people that are into it. The third thing, and the most important one, is you have to find a path to do this full time. So save money or get funding. And saving money is much better because you don't have to depend on some person who doesn't know anything more than you telling you, yes, you're building a good or bad company. So just save money and spend less, and that'll give you infinite runway. If you can build a company without taking venture funding, that's the dream. You own everything. And, I know it's not in our, interest to tell you not to raise venture funding, but that is, we're founders, and I really believe that. So save money, and then the last thing is do it. Don't think about, don't just plan this. I've often meet people who are I'm going to do it after I get my 2 years in at Google or 3 years in at Facebook, or after I do this degree or whatever, and that's such a lie, because all those companies are doing is they're making you a better employee, and you're just a better monkey in the system, and that's not the goal. You don't want to be a monkey. So in order to get out of the easiest thing to do is you just start doing it. You put together projects, things that you want built for yourself, and then see if other people want them too. And through this trial and error, it could take 5-10 years to do it, but through this trial, and if you like doing it, that's fantastic. That doesn't bother you. But through this trial and error, I think building a company is very possible. It's easier today to start a company than ever, and because of things like both technical things like Amazon Web Services and Heroku and all these other technologies that exist, but also because there's things like YC that are there to provide you with seed funding to kind of get you off the ground. So it's very possible. If you leave here thinking startups are not something I can do, that's completely a false takeaway. If you leave here and thinking like I don't like startups, that's like completely fine.
That's completely fine. Yeah. I wanted to touch, like, I was guilty of this myself, and I know a lot of people talk about it here too. That are starting companies. It's like you mentioned that if you want to start it, like save up enough money and then go do it. But a lot of people like do something and they're trying to do it part time, and that's, I mean, I don't want to answer the question for you, so like
it doesn't work. It doesn't work. That's like trying to do that jump like half-heartedly. Like, I'm just going to kind of run off this cliff. No, you're just going to free fall to your death. You have to put your full energy toward it. And two is when you work for somebody or you're working at a company or whatever, even if you're working at McDonald's, say you're an employee at McDonald's, all your brain is used during the day. So at the end of the night or on the weekends, you have like the worst mental, like the worst remaining mental power to on your company, and that's kind of the wrong way around. Like, if anything, work on your company during the day, and then do like consulting or something at nights and weekends that can keep you going to not, have to quit.
So what advice would you give them to, like, if they're doing it or thinking about doing that, like, they're scared, most people are, again, scared of, like, the money, that, like, what happens if, and of course, if you fail, you'll fail. But most people find out if you fail, you don't actually fail, you just get up and do it again. So, like, what would you tell people that are thinking about it, like, how to push them to just...
Yeah, I'll just have a cheesy answer. There's some quote, I think it's like Churchill, who says, like, obstacles are what you see when you take your eyes off the goal. So if your goal is to be free, which it is what resonated with me with startups, was just to be free, free from like the bondage of working for a company, then that's a side issue. Even risk is very miscalculated by most people. Most people think like, it's so risky to do a startup. Like, how? Like, what, are you going to end up homeless? Like, no, you're probably educated. You're probably going to find a job. Your bank account might go to zero. Who cares? And the real thing that people don't like is they don't want their peers to think that they are stupid or they fail or this idea is dumb or whatever.
That's a huge problem.
Yeah, but like, I think it's much more lame to work at a company the rest of your life. And you only have one life. If you're like in your mid or late 20s, like if you're 30, which, I've done this calculation, you have like 420 months left in your life. Just let that sink in for a minute. You have 430 months till you die. No matter how much money you have, no matter how good looking you are, no matter how many conferences you speak at, you only have 400 months. Do you want to waste it sitting at some shitty job behind some desk? And I think the answer should be no.
I'm just going to wait just 1 second. I just wanted to like let that sink in. It was like very powerful.
It should make you, like, when you lay down tonight, you should think, holy shit, like, I don't have that much time left. And if you really want to be morbid, and I did this, if you really want to be morbid, you can count out the days, convert them into pennies and put them in a jar on your table, and you just pick them out every day. And like, after doing it for a while, you're like, holy shit, this job really sucks, this relationship is terrible, I don't want to live here, I don't want to do what I'm doing right now. I'm going to make that change.
I mean, this applies to everything, not just startups, right?
Yeah. Life is short.
Startups, as you said, fail. Why? Like, why do most startups fail? A lot of people talk about this, but you've seen it. You invest in it. Like, talk to these startups. Why do they fail? And how can they?
So what I'm going to tell you is applicable to a small group of people. Because this is kind of like, if you think about startups as like wanting to be a famous basketball player or football player. Like, if we all said, all of us want to play in the, NBA or the Premier League or whatever, we could kind of laugh at that because we could quickly identify most people in here don't have the physical attributes required to actually be a professional athlete.
I don't.
I certainly don't. And if I did, maybe I wouldn't do startups. And so it's very easy to decide who's going to play professional sports. But even if you do, then you have to go through these processes. You're going to be training through your teens. You're going to get into elite schools. You're going to get scouted. You're finally going to go to some leagues. The startups are kind of similar, except none of that is visible, right? It's all of this like power of the brain, which is very hard to see and kind of organize people. But if you can get through all of that, you can get to the equivalent of a Premier League or NBA, like getting funding from a top tier fund, then you are in this answer that I'm about to give you. So for most people, this doesn't apply, but for the folks who actually do startups and get funding, the most common reasons by far are co-founder disputes. We fund YC, to give you guys some sense of the size of YC, we fund about 200 companies a year now. We've funded about 900 companies in our history, and those 900 companies are worth about $50 billion. So a good run. About 30 of those companies are worth over 100 million. So, I think we at least know what company, we have enough volume to understand which companies do well and what companies do poorly. The ones that do poorly, most of the time, the co-founders don't have the right skills or the right personalities for each other to go through this long journey. They have misaligned expectations of work, of ambition, of skills, personality, et cetera. It's not clear who the CEOs, et cetera. So once that's gone, if your founding team is well balanced, and that is, by the way, if you're trying to start a company, it's the number one thing you should try to optimize for. Make sure your founding team is really good. Everyone thinks their founding team is good. They rarely are. So the second thing, if you get past that check mark, is the market itself. And this is much, much harder. There's kind of in venture-based companies, and when I mean venture-based companies, I mean companies that have potential to be very, very large and high growth because they have a certain feature like software. Venture-based companies have 4 areas of risk: team risk, market risk, financial risk, and technical risk. Technical risk is not, you can usually identify that in advance, like I can't build a time machine. That's technical risk, but I can build a messaging app. Financial risk is the ability to make sure you can keep doing the company full time. That's how cheap you are. If you're very cheap, you can remove financial risk. Being cheap and being a successful founder is somehow very correlated, we've seen. Or you raise financing. The third is team risk. Your team has to get along. The last and hardest risk is market risk. You can make everything, do everything right, and then the dog doesn't eat the dog food that you made. And no amount of money, no amount of technical skills can completely eliminate market risk. And that's something we spend a lot of time at YC in making sure we try to identify that in advance. Our motto for YC, it's on every founder who goes to YC gets a shirt. It says, "Make something people want."
And that's all they get?
That's, well, and $120,000. But somehow the shirt is just as important. The make something people want is something that, as a founder, you should kind of burn in your brain, because even if you do everything right, you've gone through the process of saving your money, you've found a team, you've quit your job, all that stuff. If nobody buys your service or product, you're screwed. And we use this word startup all the time. It's kind of a shitty term. It's just a business. A business has to sell something, and someone has to buy it. And if you can't get that fundamental formula to work, and you can delay it, there's a lot of nuances, like Facebook doesn't necessarily make money immediately, et cetera. Google didn't make money for the first 3 years, and they became very, very successful businesses. So there's nuances there. But at the end of the day, this is a business. And someone has to like and use the product that you're building. So those are the two big things. If you can eliminate team risk and market risk, you are you are speaking at this conference next year.
But how do you, let's say, especially for people here that are starting, how do they eliminate their team risk? Like, what steps should they go through?
So one good way to figure out, my first company was a failure, so I have a lot of reference points there. The one good way to think about your co-founders is if you're excited to talk to them. So if you see something in Hacker News and you're like, Apple Pay, you're super excited about what Apple Pay's implementation or their work with Stripe or something. The person you're excited to run to tell that news to and talk about that thing with is a good co-founder, because you're just excited to share an idea with them and have them be your kind of sounding board. Now, what's even better is you're very good friends, you've known each other for a long time, so when the company starts going poorly, you're not going to give up on each other. You're like, this company sucks, I'm out of money, but I'm really good friends with Ivan, so I'm just going to keep doing this for another 2 months. And you'd be shocked at how many companies just through that little, like Alan says, just through that little trough of sorrow, make it through and then become huge businesses. So, your intellectual peers, your friends, your social peers, and then you are technical peers. We have the skills required to build a company together. One analogy I've thought of that I use is like building a company is like 3 people or 2 people dropped into a desert. and they, among themselves, have to find a way out. So one person has to know how to read the stars, one person has to like understand what animals are like they can't be around, and if they don't figure this out and find water resources, they're going to die. And a company like Google or Facebook, they're like caravans, and there's people who do individual tasks. So just being in the desert doesn't actually equip you to actually starting a company.
So, I'm sorry. What do you think is, so as an investor, you see all these companies, and YC also listed the types of companies that you guys are going to be investing in and stuff like that. So what do you see coming like in the next 5-10 years?
A couple of points I'd make that before, a couple of caveats before I give that answer. The first is, at YC, we don't do trends analysis and say like, I was talking with some founders right before here. We don't say like Bitcoin is going to be big and let's invest in Bitcoin. So we don't do this type of forward. That's almost like guessing. So that's an important point. In terms of like going forward, in terms of founders, the next 5 or 10 years, it's false to think that even when people hear about YC investing in 200 companies a year, they're like, wow, that's like, there's this like tinge of, oh, that's stupid, because 200 companies seems like a lot when most venture funds are investing in 10 or 15 or 20 companies a year. We're investing 10 times as much. But that's a false understanding, because if you think that there's only 200 good companies in the 7 billion people that exist on this planet, like you have very low regard for humanity. Like there's many more than 200 good companies every single year that could be founded. So I think over the next 5 to 10 years, ideally we as in a society and a community get to a place where, you know, you're leaving college and there's like, you can do law, you can do marketing, and entrepreneurship is one of those things. You know, that is an acceptable, normal thing to do, is to start your own company. And I think for YC, I'd ideally like us to be the organization that can help you see those, just like the NBA exists for people who want to play basketball and Harvard exists for people who want to waste a lot of money. You know, we have YC who is like, you know, is for people who want to build a private enterprise, and they come to us and we can help them build a highly scalable company. So I think that's what's going to happen with founders 5-10 years, is there's a continuing lower barrier of entry to join the startup world. In terms of technology, the next 5 to 10 years, we're getting very speculative. And like I said, I'm not comfortable making speculations. But if I had to make one, I would say the biggest challenge is probably going to be AI. I think just like for our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, kind of the nuclear annihilation was an issue. I think for human beings, it is a real threat. And now then there's a more fundamental question like, should humans be organic? And I mean, my answer is no. I think the belief that a human being has to do with their body is questionable. And so maybe we are computers in the future, or some versions of it. But I think in the next 5 to 10 years, that's a big thing that we as a society have to figure out. I think Sam, who's our president, a partner at YC, has said, you know, the U.S. government should create like $100 billion fund to figure out $100 billion in investments to figure out AI and the issues around AI. I think that's probably a pretty good path. In terms of normal consumer technologies, we are at the kind of horse and buggy era of software. I came from the automotive industry. I was an engineer in automotive for a lot of years. We are in software where automotive was in like 1920 or 1930. There's a lot of similarities. We will, in the next 5 to 10 years, have the emergence of a company like General Motors, like a general software company, which...
So Silicon Valley is like Detroit.
In 100 years, if software becomes less important, Silicon Valley will be Detroit. Just as automotive is less important to the American economy and the global economy, you know, Detroit's had those problems. I mean, it's only 100 years ago. Like, yes, it could definitely happen. But I think that's the next 5 to 10 years, specifically on technology and the industry. You'll see the emergence of powerhouses in software that'll make Google and Facebook look small. And I think there's one also idea that I have. I should write about this sometime. I just haven't had time. But I think in the next 3 to 5 years, there will be a single founder company, single employee company that will be worth $1 billion. And the main reason this is the entire structure to distribute software now it's completely available to so many more people than ever before. And so when you have these like very common OSs like iOS and Android in so many people's hands with payments already being integrated, and every day a larger and larger population of users coming online through those platforms, it's hard to imagine. WhatsApp was 51 people, 19 billion. It's hard to imagine there will not be. Instagram was 11 people that they sold for $1 billion, but Instagram is only 3 engineers. So you're almost getting to that stage right now where you will have one product with one employee that'll be worth $1 billion. And if it's one of you, that'll be fantastic.
That's a Tony Stark, right? So that company will be worth $1 billion. Do you think that is a company that'll be sustainable or be acquired? Do you think that you can get it to a point where a company will be like sustainable with one?
Even though I sold my company, the absolute and true goal is to have a self-sustaining company, an independent self-sustaining company. Now the question then you should be asking is, well, if you believe this, why didn't you do it? Well, I was poor my whole fucking life, and when somebody comes to you like Google and Larry with a huge bucket of money, you're like, well, maybe. So we've talked about this at YC. We actually see founders who actually have some money in their background actually go out for the longer haul because even that little bit of money doesn't distract them. So when you hear about there's some controversies in Silicon Valley about should founders take secondary sales. So I don't know if you guys know
just tell really short what a secondary
sale is. You're raising a Series B or Series C, you're raising $100 million, and instead of selling just the company, issuing new shares of the company, you sell some of your founder shares. So
and you pocket some of the money.
You pocket some of the money. So I have 10 million shares. Instead of issuing another million shares for the new round, I'm going to take 1 million of my own shares. Personally, I'm going to sell it and I'm going to take that money. So a lot of large companies that are worth over $1 billion, the founders now take, a couple million, 5, 10, sometimes even more, $20 million off the table, and they essentially get an early liquidity by selling their shares. That's fantastic. I don't think that's a bad thing. You're aligning then the founder's incentive with the shareholder's incentive, which is the founder then doesn't think because founders don't get paid a lot. We tell our companies, there's a direct correlation between what the CEO makes and the success of the company. The CEO starts making 6 figures, which is very little, by the way, in Silicon Valley. It's an expensive place to live. That increases burn. And so now let's say you've been running a company for 9 or 10 years and you're still making $90,000 and your company's worth $5 billion. That gives you some liquidity, and so that's completely fine in our book. It's controversial because people think that it's you shouldn't be selling any of your shares and you should only sell them when you have a liquidity event. I think that's just shallow thinking.
Yeah, but then again, it sort of stops you from selling out. You're going for the long haul and complete your vision.
The ideal world. In my mind, you guys can do whatever you want. In my mind, the ideal world is freedom. It's not having to work for somebody, I just can't understand how powerful that is. And so few people join that club. I think the restaurant owner down the street is much more of an entrepreneur than many people who live in Silicon Valley, who talk a lot about startups, who read a lot about startups, who blog about startups, but actually never do it themselves.
So the restaurant company's doing very well then. So just one more question to ask you. Why don't you do that? Why don't you do it now? So you mentioned people asking, why did I sell to Google? Why didn't I go for the long haul? So why don't you do that now?
Oh, why don't I do another company?
Yeah, and just go for the long.
It was a very, very tough decision and conversation. Paul Graham, the founder of YC, asked me to join the partnership. I think YC is YC gets lumped in with a lot of funds and a lot of VCs and stuff, but YC is a very unique organization. And as we were just talking before, it's actually small. We have about a dozen partners. If you added everybody in YC and included the people who can clean the offices, we're 25 people, 30 people, we're not many people. And so I think YC is also making a huge impact in the world. We funded, like I said, 900 some companies. I hope one day that we can be funding 1,000 companies a year. That would be phenomenal. And so I think the opportunity to really and authentically and honestly make a huge impact through this vehicle that has emerged, that's called Y Combinator, is awesome. I think about starting a company every single day of my life. Every day I still wake up and I think, oh, it would be a good idea or whatever. But I love my work at YC. I love helping founders. it's a great job. I mean, so it's not an easy thing, whether starting a company or doing YC. But
So we still might see you like in the CEO role or in the founder role.
the funny thing is, we actually had a YC partner, Harj, who was one of the first partners outside of the founding 4 partners. There's 4 partners who founded Y Combinator. Harj, I think, was the first one who was outside of that. He left YC 2 years ago, and he's in the current batch. He's in the current batch. So yeah, so he's back. So YC is so good. At least I like to think. It's so good that even though he's a partner, he's still taking his company through
YC.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, it's very awkward to do office hours because he did office hours for me.
So it's the other way around now.
Yeah, it's like giving advice to your father. You feel very uncomfortable in the process.
But it shows that it's working.
Yeah, it's very unique. I mean, we have a lot of YC. We have a bunch of YC founders here. Please talk to them. They can tell you if what I'm saying is bullshit, because there's a lot of incentive for me to tell you YC is great because, I'm a partner there. Of course, I think it's great.
But even if YC is bullshit, like you said, freedom was great. So like they can aspire to that. Exactly. Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you. So thank you guys.
I forgot to tell you my email. You guys can get a hold of me at any time. My email address is my initials, QY@YCombinator, or my first name, which is harder to spell, QASAR @YCombinator. And if you have a company, feel free to apply and send me an email and say like, hey, I'm applying, and like 2 years ago you told me at that conference to email you. It's like, I'm happy to provide feedback, and I'm here. So if you have a company and you just want to do some office hours, I'm here to.
So you can bug him.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Qasar Younis and Ivan Burazin.